What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week one wide receiver start sits. Super excited to start getting into the week one content. If you guys did miss it, I went through my running back start sit video yesterday, so check that one out after this one if you guys are interested. But if you are new to the channel, the way I go through my start sit videos is I break down every single matchup. So all 16 week one games, I'll be talking about every single fantasy relevant wide receiver, and I'm going to list them as either a start, a fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the wide receivers I feel very confident throwing into my lineup. My wide receiver one, my wide receiver two. That doesn't necessarily mean there are only going to be like 20, 24, 28 starts depending on your league size, but just players that I feel totally confident throwing into my starting lineup. The fringe options are more of like your flex plays. You might not love them as like a top two wide receiver, but they're certainly playable. And then the sits, pretty self-explanatory, guys that I would prefer to keep on my bench. If you guys enjoy the video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you have any fantasy questions, you can drop them down below and I'll make sure to get back to everyone. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night matchup here. We have the Ravens taking on the Chiefs. And starting off with the Ravens here, I think Zay Flowers is a nice starting option. He's coming off a very solid rookie season. I think he's definitely a candidate to take a leap in year two. He is the Ravens' clear-cut top wide receiver option. So I think he's a solid start. And then Rashad Bateman looking like their wide receiver too. I'm someone who likes Rashad Bateman. I was really in on him as a prospect, but at this point, definitely can't be listing him as anything other than a sit. On the other side for the Chiefs, I think this is a very interesting wide receiver room and definitely a wide receiver room that I'm very, very high on. So for this week, in week one, I have Rashee Rice listed as a start, and then I have Xavier Worthy as a fringe option. Now, I think a big piece of news for Xavier Worthy is that Andy Reid came out and announced that Hollywood Brown is going to be out for week one. So I think that definitely gives a little bump for Xavier Worthy this week. You're taking one of their top three wide receivers just pretty much right out of the mix. And I'm someone who has been very high on Xavier Worthy. I think he's going to absolutely smash this season. I do think he's a guy who's probably going to backload his production as a rookie who's kind of going to ease his way into the offense. We saw it last year with Rashee Rice, where he wasn't a huge factor early on in the season, but then just tore it up over the last like 5 games of the season. But I still think Xavier Worthy is a fine option here in week one. With Hollywood Brown out in week 2 of the preseason, Xavier Worthy stepped up and was playing starting wide receiver snaps. He was in there with Patrick Mahomes. He ran 13 routes on 14 dropbacks. He was targeted 4 times on 12 pass attempts. So he was running a solid number of routes. He was also commanding a solid number of targets. He also scored a touchdown later in that game when Carson Wentz came in and he, stuck around with the second unit. Mahomes has talked about wanting to push the ball more down the field this season. I think with better weapons, they're not going to be as dink and dunk as they were last year. And like I kind of already mentioned with the Chiefs kind of slow rolling Rashee Rice last year, easing him into the offense, I don't think they're going to take the same approach with Xavier Worthy. Maybe a little bit, but not to the same extent where like Worthy's only going to be relevant the last few weeks of the season. Like he has already climbed this depth chart. Like I said with Rashee Rice, it really took him until the last 5 games of the season last year. I think Worthy is going to be relevant from week one. So maybe he's not tearing it up like I think he will over the second half, but I still think he's playable as like a wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4, even in week one, and then going to be sitting Sky Moore, who's probably going to be the guy, kind of filling in as their wide receiver 3. So definitely out on Sky Moore. Looking at the Friday game, we have the Packers taking on the Eagles. And this Packers wide receiver room is definitely one of the more interesting situations, heading into week one. You have 4 guys here who are all pretty solid, guys who all could be fantasy relevant in Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks. At this point, it seems like most people like Jaden Reed to be their top wide receiver. Christian Kirk seems to be the number 2, Doubs is the number 3, and then Dontavian Wicks as the number 4. My initial read of this wide receiver room is that even though Jaden Reed's like the first guy off the board, I don't know if he's going to match the same number of snaps and routes as Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. I feel like Watson and Doubs are going to be the guys that are in on the 2 wide receiver sets. I feel like Jaden Reed is going to be playing out of the slot. He's probably going to be used a little bit more creatively in terms of handoffs. He was heavily targeted in the red zone last year. And then I feel like Dontavian Wicks is kind of going to filter in and then kind of operate as a handcuff if a guy like Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, or even, Romeo Doubs went down with injury, then Dontavian Wicks could kind of step up. But I do feel like this is kind of going to be almost like a committee situation at wide receiver. So in week one, I think Jaden Reed and Christian Watson are like fringe options. Would I feel ecstatic, starting either of them? Probably not, but I think they're fine. This definitely isn't like the same Eagles secondary from last year where it's just a completely like a smash matchup. They've definitely invested in the position. So I guess, some unproven weapons there on the Eagles defensive side, but I don't think it's like a cake matchup like it was last year. So fine with Jaden Reed, Christian Watson. At this point, would prefer to not play Dobbs or Dontavian Wicks. And then for the Eagles, pretty simple. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. Both very strong starts, throw them into your lineup with a lot of confidence. And then sitting their, new acquisition, Jahan Dotson. Now shifting over to the Sunday slate of games, we have the Steelers taking on the Falcons. And for the Steelers here, I feel like they really only have one fantasy relevant wide receiver, and that is George Pickens. The Brandon Ayuk re-signing with the 49ers is massive news for George Pickens because I really do think that if the Steelers acquired Ayuk, that would have been a massive hit to George Pickens, adding a stud wide receiver on an offense that's probably not going to be great. But with George Pickens being the clear-cut number one, I think he can take his efficiency from last year, add some volume on top of it. Russell Wilson was named the starter. I don't know if that's like a massive win for him, but I do think George Pickens will be a nice like high-end to mid-tier wide receiver 3 right out of the gate. And then for the Falcons, I really do like Drake London. I think he's proven he's talented through 2 NFL seasons. He just finally has the quarterback play with Kirk Cousins. So I like Drake London here as like a back-end wide receiver 1, at worst like a high-end wide receiver 2, and then going to be sitting the Falcons wide receiver 2, Darnell Mooney. Then looking at the Cardinals Bills matchup, for the Cardinals here, I know Marvin Harrison Jr. is a rookie. I'm fine firing him up as a strong start right away. He's a back-end wide receiver 1 in my redraft rankings. I don't think he's going to need like an acclimation period where he's going to have to work his way into the offense. He's going to be their number 1 right away, and I think he's a very strong start. Sitting Michael Wilson, sitting Greg Dortch. And then for the Bills, I think this is a very interesting wide receiver room, and I kind of battled back and forth with Keon Coleman as a fringe option and a sit. If you guys have watched my videos prior to like my start sits, you guys know that I'm very, very in on this rookie class. I think it was a strong class, but I think these guys also got really solid landing spots. So I have a lot of the rookies ranked pretty highly, but that's not necessarily going to translate into my week 1 rankings because I do think some of these guys need to work their way into their offenses. And that was kind of what I was battling with here with Keon Coleman. But I do think we saw strong enough usage in the preseason to anticipate a pretty solid role right out of the gate for Keon Coleman. Week 1 of the preseason, he was the only wide receiver to have a 100% route participation with Josh Allen. Then he followed that up by being the only wide receiver to have that again in week 2. So he has legit target to be Josh Allen's number 1 weapon right out of the gate. I think that's, playable as at least a fringe option here early on. And then going to be sitting Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, Mac Hollins. It seems like Shakir and Curtis Samuel are going to be eating into each other's usage. It does seem like Curtis Samuel, dealing with that turf toe at this point, is trending towards being able to play on Sunday. So not really interested in those other options. If I were going to play someone, it would be Keon Coleman. Now pivoting over to the Titans-Bears matchup. For the Titans, you can see I have D-Hop listed as a sit. I'm not overly optimistic he plays this week. I wouldn't completely rule it out. But even if he did play, like coming off an injury, it seemed like that would be on the short end of his return timetable. I wouldn't be super interested in playing D-Hop. You have an aging wide receiver heading to the season injured. Just doesn't seem like a great recipe for success. For Calvin Ridley, I'd say you probably feel stronger about him if DeAndre Hopkins is out. Right now, I have him listed as a fringe option. I think he's a fine, back-end wide receiver 3 play, fringe wide receiver 3. So that's where I have him at this point. We'll see if we get some more news with the D-Hop situation, then I can kind of reevaluate in my week 1 wide receiver rankings later on. Then looking at the Bears here, this is a pretty interesting wide receiver room. I'm pretty set with DJ Moore being their wide receiver 1. I have him as a solid start. The Keenan Allen-Rome Odunze dynamic is interesting because, like I talked about earlier on with these young guys, if you've been following my channel, you guys know that I actually prefer Rome Odunze over Keenan Allen over the entire season. But here in week 1, I actually do prefer Keenan Allen. We saw in the preseason usage, week 1, Rome Odunze was the clear wide receiver 3 in terms of his snaps. Then we saw the same thing in week 2 where it's DJ Moore, it's Keenan Allen. Those are the guys that are in there on 12 personnel. I do think at some point Rome Odunze is going to come in. He's going to overtake Keenan Allen. He's just going to be an undeniable talent. And Keenan Allen kind of getting up there in age, falling off a little bit. But early on, I do think the routes, the snaps are going to go in favor of Keenan Allen, and the Bears, I think, have the 8th highest implied points this week. They're probably going to put up a decent number on the scoreboard. So I have Keenan Allen as a fringe option, Rome Odunze as a sit. I would like to see him start to work his way, at least filter in on those 2 wide receiver sets before I feel really confident throwing him into my lineup. So that's that for the Titans-Bears matchup. Now we have the Patriots taking on the Bengals. And for the Patriots here, they're going with Jacoby Brissett. This is a very, very weak wide receiver room. So I'm going to be sitting Jalen Polk. I'm going to be sitting Demario Douglas. I think both these guys are people who could become relevant later on in the season. But here in week 1, if you're having to start either of these dudes in a 10, 12, 14 team league, your team is probably already in trouble at this point. On the other side for the Bengals, at the time that I'm recording this, we still do not have an answer on the the Jamar Chase contract dispute. But if Jamar Chase figures it out before week 1, he's obviously going to be in your lineup. I think regardless of the Jamar Chase situation, I'd feel totally comfortable starting T. Higgins. I'd say if Jamar Chase is somehow holding out of week 1, then I think T. Higgins becomes an even better option and would probably be a borderline wide receiver 1 play if he's operating as the clear-cut number 1. In the next matchup, we have a divisional game between the Texans and the Colts. And for the Texans here, I'm pretty in on this offense, especially these top 3 wide receivers. I have Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell all listed as starts. I know some people out there have concerns with all these mouths to feed. How are these wide receivers going to pay off? And I do understand, right? There's a lot of competition with these guys. If you want to throw Dalton Schultz in there also, there are a lot of mouths to feed on this offense. But there are just these offenses led by great quarterbacks with high volume, passing attacks where they can support all their weapons. I think most recently, I think about the 2021 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where you had Evans, Godwin, AB, Lenny was balling out of the backfield. You had Gronk producing, I think 14 plus PPR points per game. So there just are some instances where these teams just ball out. All the guys can eat. And I think that's kind of the situation here with the Texans. I do prefer Nico Collins as the clear-cut number 1. I think Diggs and Tank Dell are very close early on in the season. Probably prefer Stephon Diggs because he's going to be in there on 2 wide receiver sets. But I think Tank Dell definitely has upside to eat into that, throughout the duration of the season. And then on the other side here for the Colts, I'm not a huge Michael Pittman fan in redraft. I'm lower on him than consensus, but I still think he's a solid start, especially in your PPR scoring leagues. So I do have him listed as a start here, probably a high-end wide receiver 3 for me. And then I am going to be sitting Josh Downs, AD Mitchell, young, talented players, but within this specific offense, both somewhat unproven, not guys I want to rely on super early on in the season. Shifting over to the Jaguars Dolphins matchup. For the Jaguars here, if you are newer to the channel, you guys might not know, but I'm very, very in on Brian Thomas Jr., and I'm pretty out on Christian Kirk. We saw week 1 of this preseason, Christian Kirk was not in on 3 wide receiver sets. It was Brian Thomas Jr., and it was Gabe Davis. Now, if you just had that one piece of information, you might think, Christian Kirk was really solid last year. It's just a 1-game sample size. Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis, they're new to the offense. Maybe they just kind of wanted to work them in. But this is not a one-time situation. We actually saw the same thing in last year's preseason, but it was Zay Jones and Calvin Ridley instead of Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis. And then we saw that same thing carry into week 1 of last year, where Christian Kirk only had a 69% route participation, and he only commanded 2 targets on, I want to say, 30 pass attempts. So it was looking pretty rough for Christian Kirk week 1 of last year. He was the 3rd wide receiver in terms of routes. He didn't command targets week 1. He ended up kind of lucking out throughout the rest of the season because Zay Jones got hurt week 2 and then just couldn't stay healthy. So it might seem like I'm just dumping on Christian Kirk. I'm just letting you know why I don't have him as a start. I think a lot of people, if you're drafting him as a mid-tier wide receiver 3, you would think he'd be a really strong play. I prefer Brian Thomas Jr. right out of the gate. He's in there on 2 wide receiver sets. I think he's a great fit with Trevor Lawrence. I still think Christian Kirk is playable, but more of that fringe wide receiver 3 territory, maybe even high-end wide receiver 4. So I think you can definitely play him in your flex, but I would just temper expectations a little bit here on Christian Kirk pretty much throughout the entire season, if I'm being honest. And then for the Dolphins here, this is a no-brainer. You're obviously starting both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle is a little bit banged up. I believe it's a calf injury. He's someone who's dealt with a lot of injuries, especially last year, was in and out of the lineup. So definitely something to monitor, but if you drafted him 2nd, 3rd round and he's active, for week 1, you're going to be playing him pretty much no matter what. Next is going to be the Panthers taking on the Saints in a divisional matchup here. For the Panthers, I honestly went back and forth between a start and a fringe option for Deontay Johnson. I think actually live in the moment here, I'm actually going to flip it to a start. The graphic I'm looking at, I have him as a fringe play. I'd feel confident starting Deontay Johnson. I think Dave Canales wants to build this offense around him. I think he's going to be their clear-cut wide receiver one. There are definitely questions about this offense just because they were so terrible last year, but I am a believer in Dave Canales. I think they've made enough upgrades where Bryce Young is never going to be the highest ceiling option, but I think he'll be fine. I think he can distribute the ball to his weapons. So I like Deontay as a start, probably somewhere in the wide receiver 3 territory. And then I'm going to be sitting Xavier Legette, Adam Thielen. Pretty out on Thielen. You didn't expect the production he got last year. Thrown a ton of volume from Bryce Young. It ended up just falling off towards the end of last season. Feel like he's probably done being super fantasy relevant, but I would have said the same thing heading into last year. So, maybe I'm wrong. But then Xavier Legette, someone who could break out later on in the season, but week one, I don't want to be relying on Xavier Legette. And then for the Saints, I feel like they probably have like one super fantasy relevant wide receiver. Like Rashid Shaheed is interesting as like a best ball option, but in terms of someone you actually have to trust in your lineup, not interested. So Chris Olave, I think he is a pretty nice start here. Moving over to the Vikings taking on the Giants. For the Vikings, I think Justin Jefferson is a no-brainer start. Jordan Addison was honestly someone that I battled with between a fringe option and a sit. I ended up settling with him as a sit. He had a solid rookie season. He was fairly touchdown dependent. I think there are some question marks with the quarterback position with Sam Darnold. How's this Vikings offense going to look? So I think week one, Addison's a sit. I think once we're getting into like bye weeks, you start getting some more injuries. He's definitely someone who could become a fringe option. But week one, he's being drafted as like a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. I'd prefer you had someone better, especially if you're only starting like 3 wide receivers. But like if you're in a super deep league, 2 wide receiver, 2 flexes, he's probably playable, but someone I'd prefer to be sitting in week one. And then on the other side for the Giants, I know people have their concerns with Malik Neighbors. The offense is bad. Daniel Jones is not good, but I think he's going to be just fine. He's so talented. I have him as a start here in week one. And then sitting their depth options, Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson. Moving over to the Raiders-Chargers game here, I actually only have like one playable wide receiver in this game. It's Devontae Adams, getting up there in age, but should still be, competing for top 12 wide receiver production. Going to be sitting Jacoby Myers. You add in Brock Bowers. I struggle to see Jacoby Myers being super fantasy relevant this year. And then for the Chargers, I will say I was pretty in on Ladd McConkey heading into like preseason, throughout training camp, and I'd say I'm still in on him. I'm just a little bit like cautiously optimistic at this point. Week 2 of the preseason, we saw him get in for the first time, and he was not playing in 2 wide receiver sets. That's something that was a little bit concerning to me. I don't expect that to last throughout the entire season, but it does seem like maybe they're slow playing him a little bit. I think eventually he's going to be a solid option. Could definitely be, Justin Herbert's wide receiver 1 over the entire year. But week 1, I'd prefer to just take a look at the usage. Honestly, like same thing with the running back position. Like I think I listed Gus Edwards as like a fringe option, but I want to see how they're using these running backs. I want to see how they're using these wide receivers. So I do have all these guys as sits here, but I definitely think Ladd McConkey is someone who could emerge as a really solid fantasy option. In the next game, we have the Broncos taking on the Seahawks. For the Broncos here, they are very, very thin at wide receiver. I think Bo Nix is going to be just fine as a rookie. I think he's someone who can get his weapons the ball, and Courtland Sutton is their clear-cut top weapon. So I have Courtland Sutton as a fringe play. Had a decent year last year, with Russ giving him not great quarterback play. I think he's an interesting option and is someone who is playable at this point. And then for the Seahawks, this is an offense I'm super excited to take a look at here. Specifically in week 1, I would start DK Metcalf, and then I'd be sitting JSN Tyler Lockett. I like JSN. I think he definitely could be a really nice fantasy pick this year. I just don't know what the split is going to be like between these two. Last year, it was very frustrating because the Seahawks were not running a ton of 3 wide receiver sets. It was DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. Lockett wasn't having a great year, and then JSN just wasn't getting enough usage to really be, a great fantasy option. So if right out of the gate we see like JSN in there on 2 wide receiver sets, he's probably someone I'd feel comfortable starting throughout the rest of the season. But I would just like to see it first. If you drafted him as like your wide receiver 3, I don't think he's like a bad option to play. but I would prefer to just, see it first after week one. Just take a look at what those route splits are. Cowboys Browns is going to be up next here. And for the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb, obviously a no-brainer start. Going to be sitting Brandon Cooks. Then for the Browns here, I think Amari Cooper's a nice start. Even with Deshaun Watson's suspect quarterback play last year, he was still a really nice option in the games where Watson was the quarterback. He just consistently has given you like wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 production. They made the move for Jerry Jeudy this offseason. Could be interesting. Week one, not really someone who's on my radar in terms of a guy who would be playable. Now we've got the Commanders taking on the Buccaneers. For the Commanders, behind Terry McLaurin, this is a very, very thin wide receiver room. I think Terry is going to be like a fine wide receiver 3 option. I don't know if Jaden Daniels is the guy who like fully unlocks him, but he's just been very consistent from like a back-end wide receiver 2 to a back-end wide receiver 3, a very reliable option for fantasy. And then for the Buccaneers here, I think Mike Evans, Chris Godwin are both solid plays. I've talked about this a lot, but I do think these guys are going to close the gap between their production last year. In 2023, it was really the first time since I want to say like 2018, 2017, that Chris Godwin was not playing primarily out of the slot. He's going back to the slot here in 2024. In the past, when he has been playing out of the slot, him and Evans have always been, neck and neck in terms of their fantasy points per game. So I think they're both solid starts here in week one. Then I believe on Sunday Night Football, we have the Rams taking on the Lions. For the Rams, not making it too complicated, I'm firing up Puka Nacua. I'm firing up Cooper Kupp. I do actually just want to make a little point here on Puka Nacua. I've seen some comments. It seems like Cooper Kupp is gaining a lot of steam, for fantasy. His ADP is rising. And I'm honestly like in favor of that. I think he's a solid pick. If you're getting him back in round 2, anywhere in round 3, I think Cooper Kupp is a really solid option. But I feel like along with Cooper Kupp's price getting juiced a little bit, I feel like I've seen some like anti-Puka Nacua stuff. And I just want to make the case that you can be very in on both these guys. And I do just want to like almost shout out Puka Nacua for his rookie season, because it seems like people are almost acting like Puka had like this nearly 1,500 yard receiving season as a rookie just because Cooper Kupp was injured. And like, would Puka have had such crazy numbers if he didn't have like those first 4 weeks without Kupp? Like, no, probably not. But you also can't just like mess around and go for 1,400 plus receiving yards as a rookie, right? Like, you have to be insanely talented to do that. You have to be a very, very good player. So I don't think Puka Nacua is just going to have a massive fall off because Cooper Kupp is back. Even when they were playing together last year, I know Kupp was, kind of banged up, coming off injury, but Puka still outproduced him. I think it was like 15-something PPR points per game to like 13-something for Cooper Kupp. So I'm very in on both these guys. I think they're very strong starts, but I do just want to put a little respect on Puka Nacua's name there. And then on the other side here for the Lions, I mean, obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown, no-brainer. Jamison Williams is someone who I think is interesting. I'm not someone who likes to go like all in on 30-year breakouts. The percentage of guys who have kind of face planted year 1, year 2, and then have like a monster year 3, it's a very, very low percentage. However, it does seem like they want JMO to be their wide receiver 2. He's an explosive player. He's a big play guy. Maybe he puts it together week 1. Definitely not banking on it, but definitely someone, I'll be watching this season. And then the final game of the week, Jets taking on the 49ers. For the Jets, obviously Garrett Wilson is a locked-in start. It does look like Mike Williams is going to be playing week 1, coming off a torn ACL. Not someone who I really want to throw into my lineup, but someone who I think if he can get his groove back, could be an interesting wide receiver 2 option for this Jets offense, but definitely sitting him week 1. And then for the 49ers, we finally have the end of the Brandon Ayuk saga. Debo was going to be a start regardless. Brandon Ayuk, I would say, is a start. I don't know how much usage they're going to give him. Like, he's still going to be a starting wide receiver, but maybe they slow play him a little bit just to kind of ease him back into game shape. But I still think he's someone you're starting. I feel like you fire up both those 49ers wide receivers as like high-end wide receiver 2s with a lot of confidence. And that is going to wrap it up for all 16 week 1 matchups. If you guys enjoyed the video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. I will say, if you're going to give me like trade questions or start sit questions, if you guys could give me the league format, like the scoring settings, that would really help, just give me the best answer for you guys. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.